Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today with the Department of Ed team on ESSER funding. My name is Donna McInerney. I'm the CEO for the Foundation for Educational Administration, which is the professional learning arm of New Jersey Principals and Supervisors Association. We're thrilled to have you on our webinar today. As many of you already know, back in December, Congress passed a second round of funding to support schools and districts in addressing the ongoing impact of COVID-19. And this second round of funding also brought with it a tremendous amount of funding for New Jersey schools, but a lot of questions that we need guidance and answers for. What does it mean for New Jersey schools? What are the next steps? What are some of the areas allowable? What are the uses allowable? And what is the process? So today we brought together a remarkable team from the department with the answers and guidance that we all need around the ESSER II funding, the application, the uses, and best practices and examples of how we might do this. So I want to thank our colleagues at the department as we begin today's webinar. You'll have an opportunity to post in the question box any questions that you'd like to see addressed. We will be monitoring that, and we will also spend some time at the end dedicated to Q&A. At this point, I'd like to turn the session over to Kathleen Ehling, who's the Director of the Office of Fiscal and Data Services. Kathleen, thanks to you and your team for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Donna, for that lovely introduction. Much appreciated. And we're thrilled to be able to partner with you to present this information today. As Donna said, I'm here as part of a larger team, so you'll be seeing a number of different faces as we present this afternoon. Everything you need to know, or at least what we know so far about our new funding, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, or as we're referring to it at the department, the CRRRSA Act. So this act set up again, the ESSER II Fund. You're probably already familiar with our ESSER I Fund. Today, we're going to be talking about ESSER II. Next slide. So as Donna laid the groundwork, the purpose for today's presentation is to give you some background on the ESSER II Fund. We're going to talk about how the allocations were made to LEAs. We're going to spend a little bit of time walking you through the ESSER II application. We're going to spend time talking about the allowable uses, the monitoring and the reporting requirements, as well as providing time to talk about the best practices, and also spending time focusing on two specific uses of our ESSER II funds, what we're calling our Learning Acceleration Grant and our Mental Health Grant. And as Donna mentioned, we will have time for questions. If we have time, we'll pause as we move through the presentation, but please feel free to put your questions into the chat box. The department is currently working on an FAQ. It's in the final stages, and we would like to add whatever other questions we don't already have into that document. So please feel free to add your questions as we move through. Next slide. Yep, again, questions in the chat box. Next slide. Move forward, thank you. Okay, so as we said, this is the second act. The first act was called the CARES Act. It was passed in March of 2020, and it created this larger Education Stabilization Fund. As part of the Education Stabilization Fund, it created ESSER and GEAR. So we love our acronyms in the field of education. So the first ESSER fund was released last year. LEAs did receive a specific amount of money from that fund. And then Congress in December of 2020 passed what's being called a Supplemental Appropriations Act. So they essentially passed CRRRSA just to add additional funds to the already existing funds that were out there. So further funds were added to ESSER, what we're calling ESSER II, and funds were also added to that GEAR fund, or the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. One important difference between the ESSER fund and the new ESSER II funds is that under ESSER II, LEAs are not required to provide equitable services. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in later slides, but CRRRSA created what's being called EANS, another acronym, the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools Program, and that's where non-public schools will be receiving assistance under the CRRRSA Act. Next slide. So here's a nice overview for you, of the CRRSA Act. As I said, it was passed in December of 2020 and provided additional funding for those already existing funds. There was a total of $58 billion in additional funds given to ESSER and to GEAR. The ESSER II awards were made this past January of 2021. And the GEAR awards were also made in January 8th. And it created this new program, the EANS, or Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools. Next slide. So as I said, ESSER II provided an additional $54.3 billion. New Jersey received a significant amount of money through the ESSER II funds. The same allowable uses as ESSER I, which were very broad, if you recall, but the new legislation does emphasize 3 areas. Now, these 3 areas the US Ed has confirmed were allowable under ESSER I, but ESSER II just places an additional emphasis on them. The first being to address learning loss, the second to prepare schools for reopening, and the third, testing, repairing, and upgrading projects to improve air quality in school buildings. And again, just that big difference there, that there is no requirement to provide equitable services from the money that you will be receiving under ESSER II. Next slide. So New Jersey received $1.2 billion with a B, billion dollars under the ESSER II funds from Congress. We must allocate, and we did and are in the process of allocating 90% of that by formula to LEAs, to eligible LEAs. So that was done based upon an LEA's percentage of Title I-A funds for the 2021 school year. So the most recent fiscal year, which for us was 2021. The ESSER I funds were made available based upon 1920 data. ESSER II is 2021 data. And as I said, $1.2 billion, which is a substantial amount of funding. And although Congress told us to use the Title I Part A data to make these allocations, these are not considered Title I Part A funds. You can use them for any allowable uses under Title I-A, but all of the other restrictions do not apply. So that question comes up quite a bit because people hear Title I Part A and they assume that they have to follow the rules around targeted assistance or school-wide programs, and that is not the case. As you'll see, the allowable uses for these funds are very broad. Next slide. ESSER II funds are available for obligation through September 30th of 2023, so that does include the tidings period. So your first year, your project period actually ends in September 30th of 2022, and then you will be allowed a year to budget any carryover that you have, which follows the same process that we use for all of our federal funds. So you should be submitting an application and a budget that thinks about spending these funds over the next 12 months. Also keeping in mind that you have additional time for carryover, and that will end September 30th of 2023. ESSER II funds do not contain a supplanting prohibition, and that's a big deal, as we who work in federal funds know. So as a result, ESSER funds may take the place of state or local funds for any allowable activities under the program. However, just important to keep in mind that supplement not supplant requirements for other federal programs have not been waived. So you still have supplement not supplant under your Title I Part A, under IDEA, but for these ESSER funds, again, very broad use as Congress intends these to be emergency funds and recognizes that districts have unique needs, and so they want to make these funds available to you quickly, as we're doing, as well as provide a broad array of uses to address issues related to COVID-19. Next slide. As with ESSER I, LEAs that were not eligible, so any non-Title I LEAs, so LEAs that did not receive Title I funds or denied or refused, their Title I funds in the 2021 school year will be still receiving an allocation. So the state has decided to make available some of our state set aside, so that 90% that goes directly out to LEAs, the other 10% goes to what's called the state set aside. We are taking money from that state set aside to make available to non-Title I LEAs. So those allocations are already available on the department's website, so you can see what those amounts are, so that all LEAs did receive those ESSER II funds for use. Next slide. In addition to that 90% formula allocation and the non-Title I allocation, the department is also making funds available from the state set aside to address learning acceleration and mental health specifically. So $75 million was taken from the state set aside and given out to LEAs as an allocation for what we're calling the Learning Acceleration Grant. And $30 million was taken out for what's being called the Mental Health Grant. And that there are personnel here from the department to talk about that later on in the presentation. So all of these funds are being released through a consolidated application. When you open the application, and I believe our director of the Office of Grants Management is with us, he's going to walk through that with you. But when you open it, you'll see that it looks similar to your ESEA application. So it's one consolidated application where you will be required to budget your ESSER II 90%, or if you're a non-Title I LEA, your ESSER II non-Title I funds, your learning acceleration, and your mental health all in one consolidated application. Next slide. So we included this slide just as a general overview for you. This is a nice slide to have and print out so that you can compare the two funds. Very similar, as you can see, 90% in terms of the formula. The funding period's a little bit different as CRRSA came out a year later. You have another year to use those funds. The use of funds, the 12 allowable categories is the same. There's really 15 in ESSER II, but that's because there's just an extra emphasis on those three categories that I mentioned earlier. And the real big difference between the two funds is the equitable services. You did have to provide equitable services. A significant amount of your funds under ESSER I went to equitable services. There is no equitable services requirement under ESSER II. You will be required to submit annual performance reports, and we will be monitoring all of these funds. Next slide. And just very briefly, I want to touch on the Gear 2 funds, because this is where, in case you have any questions, this is where we are providing assistance to non-public schools. They set up a new program with another acronym, the EANS program. So you may hear a little bit about that, but again, no equitable services with your ESSER II allocation. The amount that you receive is the total amount that is available for use by the LEA. Next slide. Okay, next slide. We'll talk briefly about the monitoring. So New Jersey Department of Ed utilizes a risk assessment tool. We are required to do this under the Uniform Grant Guidance. We have to have some methodology for identifying districts that are considered to be at higher risk of non-compliance with federal regulations surrounding funds in the Uniform Grant Guidance. So we have a tool that we use, and it is going to be modified to include, we've already included ESSER I, we will be including ESSER II, and for those of you in the know, ESSER III will be included in that as well. Next slide. And an important note, as part of the Learning Acceleration Grant application, there's a specific certification that says that LEAs will be submitting data. There's been at least 2 broadcasts to date from the department around a specific data collection, a new data collection that is looking at where students are. And so this needs to be certified in the application that you are going to be submitting that data. We're not going to go into too much detail about this in this presentation, but more information will be forthcoming. And again, there have been a couple broadcasts released about that. So you don't have to submit the data in order to submit your application, and we're not requiring that. The data will be collected via a separate portal in our New Jersey homeroom system. Next slide. But to mention that the risk assessment tool will include an indicator that looks at whether or not this interim assessment data collection was met. So you need to submit that data on time in order not to receive any points in that indicator on that risk assessment tool. And then again, we use the tool to determine, based on a total risk score, what type of support an LEA will receive from the department, whether it's a full on-site or virtual monitoring, depending on where we are at that time, a desk monitoring, or fall into the category of universal technical assistance. Next slide. Next slide. So many of you are probably familiar with the CARES Act performance report, which you just submitted to the department recently. The United States Department of Ed is requesting that states submit data that is specific to the uses of these CARES Act funds. So we're trying to respond very quickly to what US Ed is asking us to submit. So we had to create what was called the CARES Act Performance Report, and that data that LEA submitted around how they spent this money is being submitted directly to the United States Department of Education, and it's going to be posted on what they're calling their transparency portal. And that portal, every state, all information around ESSER I, ESSER II will be listed there. So how much a state received, how the LEAs are spending the funds, all of that information is being reported up to the United States Department of Ed. So there will be several other CARES performance reports. This was the first one. The next one will likely happen this fall and then happen in the fall for the next several years until we collect all of the required information around these funds. With this amount of money, or with any money, comes with the responsibilities of the monitoring and the data collection. Next slide. All districts, all entities that receive CARES Act funds and CRRSA funds have to complete and submit these annual performance reports. So as I said, the next report will likely be released in early October, and the department will be providing information about that report so that you can prepare for that. Next slide. So this is just a copy of the website. There are now 2 specific links, one for this CRRSA and one for the CARES Act. Next slide. And when you go to those websites, you'll see a number of drop-down boxes, those blue boxes there you can click on, drop down, and you'll see specific information about the fund. So there's a quick fact sheet there if you need that. There's information on allocations, supplement, not supplant. We're trying to keep all of this organized for you, so you have one place you can go to for additional information. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll pause there if there are 1 or 2 questions before Marty goes over the application.
There currently aren't any questions right now, Kathleen.
Okay, that's great. All right, so now I'm going to turn the mic over to Marty Egan, who is our Director of the Office of Grants Management.
Thanks, Kathy. Good afternoon. I will take you through some screenshots of the application. The idea here is just to give you some familiarity with the application itself. I will let the subject matter experts handle all the programmatic questions following me. So the first thing we have here is the overview page of the CRRSA Act. So I want to just show you that, and we can move to the screen, next screen. Here is the allocation tab, and as you can see, I can't see that well now, I need glasses, but we have the ESSER II, we have the learning acceleration, the mental health, and if you did not receive Title I funds, we have a non-Title I option as well. We can move to the next slide. Our needs assessment is here, and again, here you're going to identify needs for each part of the application that you receive funding for. You can move to the next slide. And this is the data certification that Kathy touched on. So we can move to the next slide. Of course, we have assurances as we do with all our applications. So we can move to the next slide. And this is the first section of ESSER II. These are the allowable uses that we touched on that are familiar with ESSER I and ESSER II. So we can move to the next slide. These are our budget pages within the applications. We can move to the next slide. This is the district comment section. If there was anything to add in the CRRSA application, we can move to the next slide. The learning acceleration piece. This is a programmatic section, the use of funds. Again, I'll let the program office address this. We can move to the next slide. And some more on that learning acceleration. We can move to the next slide. Use of funds for mental health. We can move to the next slide. And the non-Title I piece. We can move to the next slide. And I will hand off to
Hi, Marty, that's me again. Are you able to hear me?
I was on mute.
Oh, okay, all right, so thank you very much. So as Marty said, we've got a consolidated application in there, and hopefully that makes it the planning and budgeting a little bit smoother for you. So now we're going to talk about the allowable uses. You can move on to the next slide, please. So again, as with ESSER I, LEAs can use these funds for any activity that's authorized by ESEA, IDEA, the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, Perkins, and McKinney-Vento. In addition to these broad uses, funds may be used, and I'll tell you that in the next slide. The funds are not subject to a supplement, not supplant requirement. I do want to point out that while the uses are broad, the intent of the uses must still be reasonable, necessary for the program. So the intent behind this program, of course, is to ensure that students are, that you are able to address any issues that related to school closures due to COVID-19. So again, while there is a broad range of allowable uses that we'll go through, everything needs to relate to or in some way address issues that you are experiencing due to the pandemic. Next slide, please. So again, coordination, preparedness, response efforts, providing principals and other school leaders with the resources that you need to address your individual schools. But here's a good example. While we are allowed to provide, we want to support principals and other school leaders, anything that's purchased in that particular category does need to be reasonable and necessary to effectuate the purposes of the grant. So something like putting down a new gym floor. You might be questioned as to, well, why would a new gym floor be needed to address issues related to COVID-19? So while a principal may need that, again, it has to tie back into the allowable uses and the purpose for the grant. Any other activities necessary to continue to employ existing staff, so that is a big use of these funds as well. Developing and implementing procedures to improve preparedness and response, again, so back and related to COVID-19. Next slide. And specifically, the grant does want you to think about any activities needed to address unique needs for particular student groups. So low-income students, children with disabilities, English learners, racial and ethnic minorities, students experiencing homelessness, students in foster care, those specific subgroups, student groups, you should be considering when you're budgeting your funds, how you are going to address the needs for those students. Also thinking about planning for and coordinating anything during the long-term closure, how you could provide meals and provide educational services during that time. Next slide. You can spend the funds on training and professional development for staff, purchasing supplies to sanitize and clean, so PPE, contracting out for cleaning services, all of that is allowable with these funds. Next slide. Purchasing educational technology, hardware, software, connectivity. You could also purchase assistive technology or adaptive equipment. Mental health services and supports can be provided, and that is something that will be a focus of the mental health portion of this grant. You should also be thinking about planning and implementing activities related to summer learning, supplemental after-school programs. Again, thinking about that learning acceleration, how are we going to address the needs for students, specifically students in different student groups that may have been disproportionately impacted by school closures or remote learning during this time. Next slide. And so this allowable use is one that was specifically added to the CRRSA or your ESSER II funds. Again, USED has said that these are things that would have been allowable under ESSER I, but they really wanted to emphasize them for ESSER II. So the first being addressing learning loss among students. And again, they're calling out specific student groups such as low-income students, students with disabilities. They want you to think about administering and using high-quality assessments so that we can accurately assess student progress, where we are, and where we need to move forward. They want you to think about implementing evidence-based activities and also how you can provide information and assistance to parents and families on how they can support students even during distance learning. Next slide. And then these two allowable uses again were called out in the ESSER II Fund. So anything you need to address school facilities, repairs, improvements. But again, I will highlight to enable operation of schools to reduce the risk of virus transmission and exposure to environmental health hazards and support student needs. So whatever you're doing must be reasonable, necessary, and must relate back to this particular use. Same thing with the inspection, testing, maintenance, repair, replacement, upgrade projects. You're looking to improve overall indoor air quality, and that would include mechanical and non-mechanical heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, filtering, windows, anything that would relate to that is allowable under these funds, with these funds. Next slide. And we just include this as a highlight for you. There are specific non-allowable uses listed in the legislation, so we want to make sure that you are aware of what you cannot use the funds for. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Andrea Sunderville, who is our Title I coordinator, to talk to you about how you can effectively plan and identify needs for uses for these funds.
Thank you, Kathy, and hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. Now that you've seen the structure of the grant application and know the allowable use categories, we wanted to focus our conversation briefly on the comprehensive needs assessment. Next slide, please. And as you know, unless specific needs are identified, it's going to be very difficult to decide how best to program and budget these additional federal dollars. The comprehensive needs assessment process, while it extends across all grants, really provides an opportunity for districts and school colleagues to view identifying needs as a systematic method by which you're going to be able to attain a more accurate and thorough picture of the strengths and challenges of a school community that then can be used in response to identified educational needs for all the students. The comprehensive needs assessment allows us to determine whether costs and expenditures are necessary, reasonable, and allocable to the grant program, and really leads or should lead to specific actions within a district and or school that improve instruction and thereby improve academic achievement. In other words, the comprehensive needs assessment is the centerpiece, the heart of the planning process, the basis from which districts and school colleagues develop their vision for the future. That really is why it is so important for districts to conduct comprehensive needs assessments that serve as ongoing, continuous cycles of improvement as opposed to one-time events. Next slide, please. Now, while there may be specific times during the school year when you're focusing your data analysis and really targeting that analysis of data, the continuous needs assessment process really remains as an organized and interconnected, a systemic set of steps or processes, if you will, to ensure that you're making progress and progress is being realized toward the district's vision, its mission, and goals, as well as assist districts in monitoring and assessing the impact of programs and services on student achievement. So when you're viewing it as a continuous process, as a cycle, you look at the consecutive steps in the comprehensive needs assessment, starting with and even looking at how you're going to be able to identify the needs based on that analysis of data, selecting evidence-based interventions, planning for implementation, effectuating the implementation of programs and services, and really evaluating and monitoring outcomes. The continuous improvement cycle focuses on the fact that districts are systems that drive factors to meet one outcome, and that outcome is student academic achievement. Next slide, please. Keeping in mind the concept of a continuous improvement cycle, as districts plan strategically, as you plan strategically, the phases of the comprehensive needs assessment allow our district and school colleagues to identify, collect, and analyze the data, really hone in on the strengths and challenges, highlight those strengths and challenges in key areas that are going to impact student achievement, specify priorities to address the student's academic achievement in meeting the New Jersey student learning standards, and promote continuous improvements and better student outcomes through the implementation of specific evidence-based programs, services, and/or activities. Next slide, please. The benefit of the comprehensive needs assessment process, as I'm sure you're aware, this continuous cycle of improvement, is that through the identification and analysis of a multitude of data, districts and school colleagues can determine the root causes, what exactly is happening for which we want to budget and program these additional federal dollars. It allows you to discover patterns, trends, and anomalies, identify your priority needs, the top needs of whether it's in regard to students, staff, parents, and families, and really establish goals regarding academic achievement that's based on data rather than on just mere assumptions or perceptions. Now, districts are not required to submit any data in the submission of their CRRSA applications, these ESSER II applications. But even so, we wanted to share information on various types and sources of data. Certainly before you is not an exhaustive list. However, using and analyzing data to identify specific needs will inform districts' planning processes, strengthen the effectiveness of evidence-based interventions, really lead to actionable priorities and meaningful long-term change, and promote systemic coherence, continuous improvements, and better student outcomes regarding academic achievement. And before I share the next phase of our conversation with you, I just encourage you to enter any questions in the chat on any of the elements that we've shared so far, especially the comprehensive needs assessment. So now I'll turn over our conversation to my colleague, Dr. Kim Buxenbaum, and she will be able to provide information regarding mental health supports and services. Kim?
Thank you so much, Andrea. Welcome, everybody. And if you can advance to the next slide, please. So next, we're going to talk about our mental health allocation. We felt it was really important to highlight, as we all know, that there have been, the toll of the pandemic for our students, our families, and our educators, and you as and our administrative staff has really been great in terms of our mental health and wellness and social and emotional needs. So we really wanted to make sure that we were highlighting with these funds coming in that we want districts to also use these funds to support our school-based mental health services for students, as well as offer supports for educators. And in doing that, to really support our districts to build a tiered intervention model of comprehensive school-based mental health supports, with the goal of whatever gets put into place, planning for the sustainability of that service after the life of the grant. As stressful as our times are right now, we also know in the mental health professional world and school mental health that once we're back, in brick and mortar buildings full time, it doesn't mean that the impact of everything we've been going through the last couple of years is going to go away. And it doesn't mean that there weren't also challenges around mental health, wellness, and social emotional learning beforehand. We all know that these are things that we've been working towards as a state and as a nation. Next slide, please. So with our mental health allocation, it's important for everybody to know that we really wanted to make sure that every district across the state got at least a minimum amount of money to be able to do something to build out a mental health tier. We want to acknowledge that this is seed money. It's not a pot of money that is going to necessarily help a district build out an entire three-tiered system. We're looking at it as seed money to be able to assist you in targeting where those funds go. So every LEA across the state is going to be getting a minimum of $45,000 as part of their allocation. Again, with the idea of targeting within a three-tiered system of support, tier one being universal prevention, Tier 2 being secondary intervention, those at-risk needs, and then Tier 3 being more intensive interventions. Very important, not just to making sure our educators can support our kids, our children, but also making sure that our educators have the tools they need to take care of our students, which is in turn going to support their mental health and wellness, is an allocation of 10% of these funds. So a minimum of 10% must be allocated towards professional development for our educators. The remaining percentage, whether that's 90, it can be 90% or less, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, will be used towards mental health supports and services. Next slide, please. So here is a bit of a graphic just as a reminder. Again, professional development, 10%. Obviously, we want that money to be directly related to one of the identified needs around mental health supports and services that your district is identifying. And then with the remaining amount, mental health supports and services. Again, designed to help build or enhance a tiered intervention model. So you may use it to target it to a specific tier. And it should be sustainable. And again, anything that gets put into place, always including modifications and accommodations, is necessary to ensure the access of all students, including students with disabilities, those that are economically disadvantaged or homeless, English language learners, those in foster care. I want to highlight that, again, the 10% is a minimum. So you may decide for your district that maybe you need 20%. You need to put 20% towards professional development, and then you'll have 80% remaining to build out the rest of your supports and services. That's perfectly fine. So you don't have to be locked into just 10%, but it needs to be a minimum of that amount. Also, when you're developing your plan, remember to consider and document what your current mental health support services and programs are, and where you're going to focus your funds, and determining whether you need professional development in order to do that. Next slide, please. So here we're just talking about connecting that plan to your needs assessment. We want to make sure that you're considering, again, what do you already have in place across your 3 tiers, and then is the plan that you're putting together supporting and addressing an identified need that you have found? Are you looking and connecting your planned mental health professional development around the identified need? And we really want to, again, emphasize sustainability. So whatever you're putting in place is sustainable after the life of the grant, because again, we know the challenges and the impact is not going to go away, and there are still going to be students and educators that need supports and services. And then, of course, we want to make sure that whatever you put in your project description is connected to the budget. Next slide, please. So we thought it would be helpful to give some examples for identified needs. So at Tier 1, you may have a preschool program, and you may decide that you want to invest in the pyramid model. The pyramid model is the preschool equivalent to our CASEL, our social emotional and the social emotional learning models that we have for our K-12 students. So you may decide you want to invest in that program and implement that for your preschool students. You may also decide that you want to contract with a provider to come into your district and your schools to offer well-being support groups as a part of taking care of your educators and staff that work in the building every day. Next slide, please. Here again at Tier 2, these are just a few examples of of how the monies can be used. You may decide that at the Tier 2 level, you want to, again, create a partnership with a local community mental health provider to perform risk assessments for students that are in crisis, with the goal of reducing or eliminating the need to use the emergency room or emergency department in order to screen those students and determine if they are a harm to self or others. That way, with a community mental health provider, you also then have a direct link to connect those students and those families to community-based services that will be able to support those students and families. Next slide, please. Here at Tier 3, again, our most intensive level of supports that we would put into place, right? Maybe you want to contract with a mental health provider to come into your district to provide those individual and group therapeutic services for identified students. Or, we're moving into spring and we're going to be moving into summer soon, right? So maybe you want to identify certain district staff that you have that can provide those mental health services, your school psychologist, your student assistance counselor, your school social worker, to be able to provide some summer gap services and provide individual, group, and or family therapy. So those students that are most needy, and that we know that have real significant and intense levels of need, can have some touch bases and some touch points over the summer. Next slide, please. Here we have just a couple of examples of professional development. So maybe you want to access training around a Tier 1 school-wide program that addresses any one of these issues or multiple: mental health literacy, positive school climate, trauma-informed practices, cultural competence, etc. I do also want to let folks know that as part of the application, we have developed a couple of handouts that will go with you to be able to help you when you're coming up with your needs assessment. In terms of more considerations, we have broken those out by tier, as well as a handout that gives some example scenarios of how you can use those funds to build out, again, by tier, and looking at students, staff, and families. So we tried to really organize this in a way that would help just give you some ideas. These lists are not exhaustive, but meant to be a guide to assist you in your needs assessment and developing your plan. Next slide, please. So here is a sample scenario slide. We thought it would be helpful to put a slide together that shows how you can use these ESSER II funds, and also highlights the fact that mental health and learning loss / acceleration, as we're calling it, are both allowable costs within the larger ESSER II fund allocation. So welcome to Riverview Summer Learning Academy. And we thought that as folks are starting to plan for summer, you may want to look at this slide to give you a sense of how you can allocate your funds. So in the first column, we have just our large ESSER II pot. Let's say that you're allocated $100,000 as your larger pot, and you decide you want to use $50,000 in order to purchase supplies, to sanitize, clean your facilities, maybe purchase materials or install materials to ensure social distancing. And so you'll have $50,000 to do that. Well, now you have $50,000 remaining. We know with the mental health allocation, you have $45,000 that every district is getting at a minimum. And then you decide that you're going to take another $25,000 from that larger pot to add to build out your tier. So now you have $70,000 that you're working with. Sorry, I had to do a little quick math in my head, right? And so you're going to use that to contract with a specialist to come in to provide some different types of therapies at the Tier 1 level to your students during their summer academy. Okay, or you may decide that you want to contract with a mental health provider to facilitate individual and group activities and therapeutic services for those identified students. So those are just a couple of examples there. And now you have $25,000 remaining from your larger allocation, and you're going to add that to, let's say you received $55,000 for your learning acceleration grant piece as part of that consolidated application, and you're going to add another $25,000, the remaining $25,000 of your 100 to this pot for a total of $80,000. And then you're going to use that to look at improving and doing some small group instruction for your STEM and ELA. There are a number of different percentages and buckets that you need to do for a learning acceleration, so I'm not going to go into depth with that. But we just wanted to make sure that we had a slide for you that highlighted just some examples of how you can use your funds. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues that are going to talk about our learning acceleration. So welcome, Dr. Peter Frank, and you're on.
Thank you, Dr. Kim Baxenbaum. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Peter Frank. I'm an Eagleton Science Fellow in the Division of Academics and Performance, and I'm excited to provide an overview of the Learning Acceleration Grant. This allocation is meant to focus resources on extending learning opportunities. This means we are meeting all students where they are and providing them with the supports that they need to move forward and accelerate. Also, this work, as it relates to the department's road forward, is meant to bridge the gaps of learning opportunities, not just caused by the COVID-19 disruptions, but also the opportunity gaps that existed prior to the pandemic. On the next few slides, I'm going to provide a high-level overview of the Learning Acceleration Grant. Next, thank you. The state has set aside $75 million for learning acceleration with a minimum allocation of $25,000 per district. These funds can be used to support pre-K through 12 learning opportunities. Districts are encouraged to utilize student data and to review with all their stakeholders to identify and understand their student needs. For the Learning Acceleration Grant, 25% of it should be used for strategies that support the broader learning ecosystem and is available to support more than one identified stakeholders, such as students, staff, and caregivers. So we're thinking of family and parents. 75% of a district's allocation will be used to support research-based academic enrichment activities and experiences, such as one-on-one intensive tutoring, summer learning academies, and school year extended learning opportunities. On the next few slides, I will get into more details about each of these allocations. As always, we encourage you to collaborate across districts to identify the needs, best uses, and the priorities of your students. Next slide, please. In using the Academic Enrichment Fund for students, districts are required to spend 75% on STEM-related activities and experiences, as well as the remaining 25% on experiences that is related to STEM and literacy and the arts. Utilizing research-based academic enrichment strategies, districts may focus on a full spectrum of content areas like those shown on the slide. In the Division of Academics and Performance, we are especially excited for the focused resources on these areas, particularly STEM, as we know this is a need and desire of educators to increase their focus and provide more experiential learning to students. Towards the end, we will revisit our Riverview example for the learning acceleration portion. Next slide, please. So research-based academic enrichment activities fall into 3 buckets: summer learning academies, school year extended accelerated learning, and one-on-one intensive tutoring. Key themes here include struggling students, highly effective teachers, small group instruction, and a multi-tiered system of supports. Together, these ensure that students with the greatest needs receive the best enrichment supports to accelerate their learning. Finally, any and all academic enrichment plans must be connected to the New Jersey learning standards and include accommodations necessary for the participation of economically disadvantaged students, English language learners, homeless or foster care students, and students with disabilities up to age 21. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. So 25% of the learning acceleration goes towards supporting the learning ecosystem. This ensures that students are surrounded by an environment that promotes their learning and excellence, whether they are working on their own or with peers, in the classroom or on the school campus, as well as at home. Using these funds for all stakeholders, evidence-based strategies are at the discretion of districts, and the desired outcomes should be explained and measured. So for students, we want to encourage a growth mindset, and this is where the recognition and encouragement of effort, as well as the development of resilience in struggle, leads towards growth and excellence. Examples of expenditures here include everything from purchasing curriculum materials and organizing assemblies. Next slide, please. So our school staff play a critical role in fostering a culture of accelerated learning in the ecosystem. So grants can be used to provide or facilitate professional development for pre-K through 12 educators on various initiatives that have a direct impact on accelerating learning. These include effective use of extended instructional time, using assessments to inform instruction, and evidence-based strategies that inspire a growth mindset. Expenses here may include, but are not limited to, professional development, staffing coverage, extended time for professional learning communities. If the staff is a key focus of enhancing the learning ecosystem, outcomes should be defined, measurable, and tracked. Next slide, please. Thank you. Parents, families, and caregivers are the final stakeholders in a student's learning environment. Partnerships between districts and the at-home care of students are critical to fostering student success and learning. Each child's caregiver should understand and have access to their district's multi-tiered system of supports. This is particularly important for at-risk students and caregivers that may not know how best to partner with districts to support their child. So re-engaging and empowering up these partnerships may include, but are not limited to, seminars on how best how a district monitors their child, supports their child, in addition to how parents can leverage these supports. Helping parents understand and facilitate quality learning at home, in addition to encouraging their child's growth mindset. Thirdly, training programs for parents to understand grade level expectations, the 2020 New Jersey Learning Standards, and the Portfolio Appeals Pathway for graduation. Next slide, please. So welcome back to our Riverview Summer Learning Academy. This is a plan that combines funds into a comprehensive summer program. So focusing on learning acceleration, data from the needs assessment here shows that Riverview needed a math academy, a summer arts program, as well as professional development for teachers related to accelerated learning, and seminars for families to use the multi-tiered system of supports. $55,000 came from the Learning Acceleration Grant, which is then bolstered by $25,000 from the ESSER II funds. This results in a total of $80,000 towards this initiative. A detailed breakdown of the budget will be on the next slide. So in this example, Riverview is spending $80,000 on learning acceleration. Because $55,000 or $55K is specifically from the Learning Acceleration Grant pool, only it is subjected to the required allocations, while the remaining $25,000 is not. So the first column shows the required allocations and sub-allocations of the grant. The second column contains the Learning Acceleration Plan, or the Summer Learning Academy, where for the STEM program, we have the Math Academy, and we have the Arts program for the Literacy and Arts Enrichment. Under supporting the learning ecosystem, again, we have the PD for teachers and the seminar for our families. Now, the third column shows the breakdown of the overall Learning Acceleration Grant at $55K, where 75% of it is used for academic enrichment. That comes to $41.3K, and the remaining 25% of the LA grant is used to support the learning ecosystem at $31.7K. The fourth column shows the sub-allocations for each of these major buckets, where 75% of the academic enrichment is used for the Math Academy, which works out to be $31K, and the remaining 25% of the academic enrichment supports the art program at $10.3K. Under supporting the learning ecosystem, there's no sub-allocation requirement, which means how the funds are distributed and the initiatives here are at the district's discretion. Additionally, the $25,000 ESSER II funds can be applied anywhere in the district's plan. Now we can look to the next slide, where we can summarize the budget and how it falls into these various buckets. So I am joined by the incredibly thoughtful and insightful Deputy Assistant Commissioner of Performance, Diana Pascali, who will be weighing in with me on the Q&A portion of this presentation. Thank you, and this concludes the learning acceleration portion, and I'll hand the presentation back to Kathy Ehling.
Thank you so much, Peter. So we do have some time for questions. We have about 5 minutes left if there were any questions that came in during the rest of the presentation.
So Kathleen, we've got a couple of questions, and Leslie can join in if she wants to. We've got 3 in the question box. So the first one, was addressing the air quality, but does that also need to be reasonable and necessary?
So that's
that
a good,
was from early on in the presentation.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's a good question. The specific language in the grant is very clear, and it says air quality. So as long as it's something that is related to improving overall air quality, that should be allowable.
Perfect, thank you. The next question, this came in at about 2:15. Will you talk a little bit about examples for the ecosystem, if you don't already have them included, which I think you did already include those. I don't know if you want to expand on that.
So Peter or Diana, is there anything you want to add on the learning ecosystem?
Hi, Kathy. Thank you. Sure. We did go through a few examples, so I don't know the timing of the chat, and we are looking to build up examples as we see and hear about them throughout the districts. So I think it's, when you're thinking about learning ecosystems, really think about growth mindset. So I know some groups there are some schools that have professional learning and book clubs and professional development around equity and building students' understanding of their own progress and individual learning, which we saw a lot of great independent learning going on over the pandemic. So I think if you're thinking about it that way and geared towards staff, also our commissioner has made it very clear that we want to make sure funding could also alternatively or in addition to in that ecosystem go directly to students, student groups and student seminars on building their own growth mindsets. So those are character building programs that you may have in your own district or around. And then finally, the parents and community. So we will build out as many more concrete examples as possible, but also welcome all of you if you feel that you're doing something in your district that would be a great exemplar. Happy to provide more. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Diana. Next question, are we permitted to pay staff that would work over the summer to develop launch units for September?
Yes, we've had this question come up, and we just want to make sure that when you're putting that in your application, your grant application, that you indicate that the curriculum work is being done as a result of school closures, and making sure that you're aligning curriculum, any changes that need to be accounted for as a result of COVID-19. So just including that language would make that an allowable use, absolutely.
So addressing things like formative assessments, diagnostic assessments, pre-assessments, all of that.
All of that.
Perfect. Thank you. Next, should we utilize a time and activity approach when paying staff?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, so we'll take that question back. I may have to ask someone else, unless someone else from the department can answer that.
Kathy, it's Andrea. Maybe the question relates to time and activity reports and the requirement that districts track the time and activity through that formal process, either the actual reports or some type of scheduling. And that would be required because it is federal dollars, if that's the purpose or the intent of the question.
Thank you, Andrea. So treating that just like you would for any other federal money where you're paying staff and keeping track of that, yes, that would we would require that you do that.
Thank you. Next question I can answer. Will this presentation be shared with the attendees? Yes, within 24 hours, the recording and the presentation will be emailed to everyone registered for this webinar. We'll also post it on the NJPSA FEA website. Next question, expanding on the first question, is upgrading HVAC systems for improved air quality include air conditioning if it's not already in place within the older system?
Yes, air conditioning and upgrading HVAC are allowable uses.
Perfect. Next question, as part of the learning ecosystem, can the use of mental health work be used while addressing staff and families and recognizing how the mental health issues may stall academic progress and the cooperation of families and schools?
So I'll turn that over to our mental health experts with just the caveat that professional development is an allowable use. But Kim or Kelly, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yes, the short answer is yes. You can use that for professional development, and always good to have the professional development tied to a need that you may be using that to build out tier 1 and putting in some other mental health supports and services at that level. And in order to have that be implemented, perhaps there's some professional development that your staff needs. So that professional development is really geared towards your educators. It doesn't mean that you can't, if you want to provide some supports or groups or information to families, that you can't use some of those funds in order to secure some services, an outside provider, or maybe you have internal staff and you need some financial supports to put something like that together. You could use the funds for that as well. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Looks like it was yes confirmation on that time and activity question. Next question. So 25% of the learning acceleration money could go to paying staff to analyze data over the summer to develop individual plans in the fall, or do you have to use it for PD?
I'll defer to Diana and Peter on that question.
I think, no, that's absolutely fine. You can consider it a learning, a professional learning community type activity, and we encourage the use of the time spent on reviewing formative data.
Wonderful. So I think that's the last of the questions that I see. Leslie, did I miss any?
No, I don't think you did, Donna. That was wonderful.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I want to thank the DOE team for sharing their wisdom with us today. I want to thank all of you who joined us today and for staying on a Friday afternoon. I know I learned a lot, and I think we've got on the very last slide on the screen, we've got an email address should any additional questions come up after this presentation. Thanks to everyone. Have enjoyed this lovely summer day that I see outside here in New Jersey. Have a great weekend.